Hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming tonight. This is our first in-person talk, and we've got Jane Fenton with us. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And it's going to be a fun night, we hope, a fun talk.
How do you know that?
You'll get to ask questions at the end. For the people watching on Teams, there's a Q&A function at the top right corner of the screen where you can ask your questions throughout the talk, and then at the end we'll make sure to ask them to Jane if there's time for it. But yeah, without any further ado, I'll leave you with Jane Fenton.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks very much, first of all, for the invite. And just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm actually a social work lecturer here. And social work and community education and education, that's the school that I come from, maybe has a bit of a reputation for not being the best for free speech and for having a bit of a censorious climate, or at least a quite defined political orientation. And I would say that that reputation is probably quite well deserved. So in some ways I'm a bit of an outlier, not entirely alone, but I do kind of stand out, I think. So I've written quite a lot and published a couple of textbooks and articles, mainly on social work, also probably from quite a kind of lefty political angle. But more recently, I've become concerned about issues of free speech and free debate, and I've been worried about that. So I wrote an article called "You Can't Say That" with the social work professor, who is also somebody who's very much a supporter of free speech, and we got that published. And I've also written an article for Community Care, which is a social care magazine in the UK, just about the importance of free speech. And of course that was a bit of a risk because that's a social work audience. And what actually happened, the response to that, there were a lot of comments, and I got unsolicited emails from social work students and social work academics who said, you know, thank God people are starting to say these things because we're not allowed to say them in the classroom. So that's why I'm here, because this is my new area of scholarship almost. This is what I'm interested in now. So if we could, now it's very hard to judge how to do this today, so I thought I'll just do a little bit of history. You probably all know it, but I thought I would just start there anyway. So John Stuart Mill, okay, one of the great liberal thinkers. You all know about him, yes? Yes, I thought so. Do I even need to say this? Even put up a picture of it. And it's just, I suppose, the main thing. I'm trying desperately to get an article published at the moment called "Reclaiming Liberal Values for Social Work Education," and I'm struggling. It could be because it's crap, but I haven't struggled this way before when I've written my lefty stuff. So, well, who knows? Maybe it's a bit crap anyway. But so yeah, liberal principles, and John Stuart Mill's, of course, John Stuart Mill, one of the main people. And his sort of the three things he said that are important about free speech. You have to listen to other people's points of view because one, they may be right and you may be wrong, and two, they may be wrong, but it's good for you to have to re-articulate your arguments so that they're not getting dusty and sitting there on the shelf. But the most likely one is that you both probably have partial truth, and let's face it, that's what we're trying to get at. Trying to get at the idea that there is a real truth out there, and how close can we get to that? Okay, so moving on from him, I don't know if you've heard of Jonathan Rauch. He wrote a book called Kindly Inquisitors, which I would absolutely, it's a little thin book, I'd absolutely recommend you to read. And he talks in that book about how knowledge is produced in liberal democracies. So we're not told in Western liberal democracies what to think. You know, there's nobody saying in a totalitarian way, here's the truth. What we do is we produce scholarship and we put it there into the public realm for everybody to judge and to rip apart and to criticise. And then somebody else comes in with something else, and the same happens there. And that happens in our institutions, especially in our universities. So when you think of it, it's absolutely fantastic. Because ideas are then, it's the checking of everybody, by everybody. And the ideas around things like we all have biases, we all have confirmation bias. The only way to deal with that is to expose that to other people who have different biases. So knowledge production works in that way. And what happens then is ideas either stand up to that kind of public scrutiny or don't, and they're debunked, really. So, and that's how we decide in a liberal democratic way what gets taught, what becomes the canon of knowledge. So my example there is creationism, for example, has been pretty much debunked, and evolution has been pretty much held up as knowledge. So creationism isn't taught in a university. People are free to believe that and talk about it, but it's not part of the canon of knowledge that we teach, whereas evolution is. So what Jonathan Rauch says is that you have this settled body of knowledge, but round the outskirts you have a kind of frenzy and a debate and a discussion and all of that happening in our institutions, happening in our classrooms. And that's the way that we advance knowledge. And that depends on things like anybody who's written an article knows that you put it in, it gets peer reviewed, and you get a good kicking sometimes if it's crap. Or people say, okay, yeah, but there's this part, and that's that frenzy of contested knowledge around the outside of the settled body. And it's really precious when you think about totalitarian regimes where people are taught what to think and told what to think, and you can't depart from that, or you'll be punished. So we need to hang on to that. And Jonathan Rauch added a bit to his kind of most recent edition of this book about how minority civil rights depend on that system. And he talks about being a gay man growing up in the 60s and real oppression, gay people having very few rights, and how he went on marches and got involved in the discussion. He said if there had been hate speech laws then, they would have been told to shut up because the government had a moral objection to homosexuality. So, but because we have this system, they were able to say, well, you see, when you say things like homosexual men and predators, well, we can actually prove with data and evidence that's not true. And we can gradually chipping away until it became part of the settled body of knowledge that, well, that's fine. As Helen Pluckrose says, some people are gay, get over it. This is why I suppose it's quite galling sometimes that we hear that we can't criticise things in case minority people feel unsafe or whatever, when actually that system has helped so many people achieve equality, women as well. So that book is really worth reading. And so that's the background of why we do things in the way we do in universities. And then, we have it enshrined in law that academics, especially this part, are allowed to do all of these things, hold cold opinions, present controversial or unpopular points of view. Legal protection. And I'm sure Neil Finn spoke a bit about that when he talked to you. I was totally intimidated, by the way, at the list of speakers you've had. And then you've got me coming over from the School of Education, right? So that wasn't a great start. I was quite nervous when it heard that. But anyway, so it's enshrined in law. There we have a whole kind of history of why we do it this way, and here we have it enshrined in law. So, yeah, thank you. So far, so good. Fantastic. Now, when I bring this up, like in lots of debates, do you know who that is? Anybody know who that person? Yeah, it's Titania McGrath. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, she's brilliant.
She's brilliant. So I thought, when I brought this up with colleagues, for example, like having an argument just now or a debate about viewpoint diversity, and what always happens is, well, what about hate speech? So, what about hate speech?
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thanks. So, under the Equalities Act, we're not allowed to harass people, and we're not allowed to violate people's dignity or create a hostile, degrading, humiliating, blah, blah, blah. Quite right, okay? You don't want to be doing that. But sometimes to engage in a controversial subject might be offensive to a person or to some people. And actually, sometimes that's too bad. Okay, you know, that's really too bad. And actually, if that gets contested, the courts will decide on that. And academic freedom is balanced against it. Remember, we're allowed to bring up controversial things and talk about them. So it's not just the person's perception of offence that's important. There is an objective view that will be taken about, were you intending to harass somebody? I suppose would be the acid test. And that, but it's difficult and it's quite scary. And that was Merseyside Police with a huge banner outside of Tesco's or something saying being offensive is an offence. And of course they're completely wrong and had to roll down the banner quickly and then slope off. And then they said, I'm sorry, that was a misunderstanding. So it wasn't, you were just totally 100% wrong. And but if the police were confused, the ones who are doing the arresting, then you know we can see that the people aren't confident about this. So, but anyway, so far so good really, that we can see in law then that we're allowed to bring up these things and discuss it. So what is the problem? So what's the problem? So I've looked at students and at academic staff here, not my research, but so there you'll see a study of 1,000 students in the UK found that the majority favoured minority groups' protection from offence as more important than free speech, with women being especially censorious. Now, that's really, really important, isn't it? Because we have there that kind of, that idea, again, about the protection of minorities. Back to Jonathan Rauch saying, you know, that's wrong-headed because free speech helps minorities. But here you have, we can't, it's not as important to discuss things as it is to protect people. Protect people from harm or from feeling unsafe, all these words. And then another study more recently, again looking at a similar thing, said 30% of students would choose a free speech position, for example, so under the third, invite controversial speakers onto campus, for example. A minimum of 20 would choose no platforming in the interest of emotional safety of minority groups. There's that thing again. But the interesting thing here was a sort of malleable, undecided group. So if the students were given a paragraph talking about John Stuart Mill and the importance of free speech and all of that good stuff, they were much more likely to support free speech. If they were given something about the emotional safety of minority groups, then they were more likely to support that. So I don't know what conclusion you can draw from that. There's something there though, isn't there? You know, that it's important. If we're priming every class with trigger warnings and talking about emotional safety, we're doing that. We're doing the equivalent of giving a paragraph. So that's something to think about. Anyway, I just wondered, you know, is what we've got there the tyranny of the consensus that John Stuart Mill talked about, you know, that stultifying conformity. So the consensus is that minority groups have to be protected from speech harm, emotional harm. And is that what we're seeing? That the tyranny of that, time and time again. So that the argument can't get past that. Because, well, do we want to make people feel unsafe? Well, of course we don't, but it's more complex than that. So anyway, a 2020 huge study. Well, it was a huge, let me see, I made some notes about this. It was a sample from a YouGov panel that academics already sort of fill in surveys and stuff. So academics didn't self-select into this study really because they were particularly interested in free speech. So it's quite an unbiased sample. There was 820 academics replied, and that was a good sample, well above what you would normally get. So quite robust research. And what the study found was that, there's the breakdown, 53% identified as left-wing, 35% centrist, 9% only as right of centre. And people were asked if there's a hostile climate towards people with your political beliefs and a clear gradient. The more right-leaning an academic was, the more they felt that the environment was hostile. And do you refrain from airing your views in teaching and research? Again, same gradient. Right-leaning staff, yes, they do refrain from that. And among right-leaning staff currently teaching in social sciences and humanities subjects, 50% say yes, we refrain from that. Just 18% of Leave supporting faculty are comfortable expressing their views on Brexit. 18% of people who voted Leave only can say that. Now, so that, is this the chilling effect that we hear being talked about? Or is it just that people are, that it's mere perception? Because when I was trying to have that argument in my school, another thing, not just what about hate speech, Jane, what about emotional safety for people, the other thing was this nonsense about cancel culture and all that and the free speech crisis. It's rubbish, it's just stoked by right-wing bigots and it's not true. So you could say, well, that's just their perception. It's probably not like that. You know, you probably speak about Brexit till the cows come home and do bother. Right, so well, they looked at that as well. So if we could move on. The next set of questions they asked were, do you actually discriminate on political grounds? Do you discriminate against people? And that quote there is from the paper, that collegiality is an important part of academic wellness, and social ostracism represents an example of Mill's despotism of custom in action. So actually freezing somebody out, that is quite tyrannical and certainly chilling. And 86% of those surveyed would be comfortable sitting next to a Remain supporter. That falls to just 54% would be happy to sit beside a Leave supporter, right? And only 37% would be happy to have lunch with someone who has gender critical views. Right, and they were saying that. So this isn't a perception of those who feel silenced. This is the silencers saying, yeah, we don't want to have lunch with these people.
One of those people.
Yeah. So only 1 in 8 supported dismissal campaigns, so there's more questions, but they were given 4 hypothetical case studies, and across all 4, 1 in 4 academics supported at least 1 dismissal campaign. So that's a minority, but it's still powerful, and that's in social sciences and humanities again. And there was widespread discrimination on political grounds. Things like academics were asked, would you mark down a grant application or something they were reviewing, like my bloody paper that I published, right? So would you mark that down or be inclined to review it negatively if it had a certain political meaning? And people were saying yes, quite widespread. A third of academics would seek to avoid hiring a non-Leave supporter, and we estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of those reviewing a grant bid would mark it lower if you took a right-wing perspective. I've got these reports, they really are fantastic, on my reference slide if you want to follow them up. Some really good information in that. I don't know, just to give you an example of one of the case studies where academics said we would, this was the one that out of all of them, the academics said they would support somebody being dismissed for. And it was a research, if you had a colleague whose research showed that having a higher percentage of women and minorities correlates with lower performance in an agency. So imagine if somebody did that or looked at teams or whatever, and they found that, oh right, okay, the correlation's in that negative direction, right? So I want to publish that, get that out there, because it's a thing, right? So that was the one that quite a number of academics said they would support that researcher being dismissed for even doing that research. They were asked, and then they said, you know, what if then what if people signed an open letter, thousands of academics signed an open letter asking that this person get dismissed, would you sign it? And if there was a letter saying, no, this person shouldn't be dismissed, would you sign that one? So as some people said they would sign the dismissal one, some people, but not a lot, said they would sign the other one. And actually, there was just a huge amount of silence and self-censoring. Okay, can we move on? So all of this exerts a chilling effect, and of course, as the author said, even if that kind of political discrimination, maybe we're all inclined to do that, you know, if you're reviewing a grant application or an article that's coming from different, maybe even with the best will in the world, we can't help being a bit biased. So even if that's across the spectrum, the political spectrum, that happens, when you have a university made up with such a high proportion of left-leaning academics and such a low proportion of right-leaning academics, then there is a massive imbalance. So, you know, and it's built in because of that. And I know, because of this debate that I'm involved in too, I know that academics have said to me, and I've said publicly, I feel like I can't speak out. I do keep parts of me hidden. You know, and at one point in this document, the author says that viewpoint diversity does exist. It's just hidden, because people are too afraid to be really honest about it. God, and you go right back to Mill and think, oh no, this is a dreadful situation. Yeah, and people who self-censor, however, are acting quite rationally, because we can see the punishments that can go on. Okay. Now, this is just my last bit, and one of the things that I've been quite interested in, and I was doing this in terms of social workers, I was looking at younger social work students and younger social workers actually, and looking at the difference in their politics to older. And this was before I got interested really in the whole free speech thing. What I found from other scholarship, from a little bit of research I did myself, was that younger generations tended to be more right-wing economically than previous generations, and more authoritarian than previous generations, but better at diversity. That last bit wasn't my research, but there's a bit of research to see that. So I was kind of interested in that political shift anyway. Generation Z or millennial. Yeah. Gen Z.
I'm a millennial.
Right.
Millennium. That's it. What's before 2000?
So the Kaufman also looked then at where were the most intolerant academics coming from? The ones who were the ones who were going to dismiss that person who did that research, no question asked. And there were two main predictors. One was identifying as a left-wing activist, not a surprise there, and the other predictor, significant, was age. So younger staff tended to be more supportive of restrictions, but the authors are not sure if that's a cohort effect or if that's just an age thing. Doesn't know. I'm wondering if you're sitting there thinking about your friends, and so that kind of fit a little bit with my finding about authoritarianism. You know, that is there a generational effect about intolerance and authoritarianism? I wonder. But I suppose it's the boomers who are going along with the deans of the schools and the principals of the university. The boomers are not doing any better. But a similar study that Kaufman did in the UK, in Canada, and the US, again found that left activists and younger academics are the most illiberal. And they found that millennial academics are twice as intolerant as those in the age group of 55 to 64 in Britain, 4 times as intolerant in Canada.
No, I agree.
And close to 3 times intolerant as the US.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
Wow.
And can you see that?
Yes.
I mean, it's anecdotal, but can you see that?
Yes.
He should not be allowed to say that, simple.
Yes.
You know, it's kind of simple and uncontested.
Oh, yes. Sadly.
I was listening to a podcast recently by Jonathan Haidt, I think, and he was saying that he thinks, was it him? Maybe not, but somebody like that, or Stephen Pinker, I can't remember. One of them was saying that there's a lack of teaching about things like the Enlightenment principles. about how free speech was hard won. And before that, if you blasphemed, you were kind of burnt or torn to shreds or something, you know, witches were burnt and all that. And it was the principles of the Enlightenment that brought science and reason and discussion and controversy, and free speech is such a foundation of that. And that people don't really know that or aren't taught about it. So that's what whoever it was that was speaking was saying was part of the problem. So I don't know if that's true or not. It does ring true, but if we could move on. So just finally, Kathleen Stock example, you know, we were talking about there. And I was just thinking about this in terms of Jonathan Rauch's idea of knowledge production. And the gender identity belief versus gender critical beliefs is still contested. It's still part of that furore around the outside of the settled body of knowledge, like gravity. You know, it's not there yet. And so it is quite correct that that is the subject of a lot of debate and discussion. And we should be doing that. And instead, what's happened is that there was the closing down, the assumption that people will be harmed by that debate, the assumption that it's already settled when it isn't, all of those assumptions, and also, you know, the small but powerful minority of illiberal activists, probably who identify themselves, I'd imagine, as left-wing activists, probably. Were they quite young? Kaufman would say that would be likely. And so campaigning to get her sacked, and I'm just thinking, is that a younger, illiberal generational thing? And the academics too that joined in with that. Might they be younger academics? Pure speculation there, I have no idea. But I wondered. But as I say, the boomers capitulate as well. Everybody's doing it. And back to that thing that the rationale for the absolutely terrible treatment of Kathleen Stock, whose book I have read. I had read before all of this, and it's absolutely fantastic, clear thinking, nothing. If anybody had read it, they would know she is not a transphobe, but she's a clear thinker who differentiates between gender ideology and sex, and says maybe it can be tricky if we base policy on gender identification for these reasons. You know, but anyway, she's now resigned. And again, what underpins that? Back to that idea that minorities need protection from words and ideas. So thanks very much for listening. I don't know what's to be done. I was hoping that you'd be able to take the end of that. I'll take my notebook and I'll write it down. So that's that. Thank you.